Richard was a man who lived in a world of luxury. He had built his wealth through years of investments, business deals, and a talent for spotting opportunities that others missed. People called him one of the most successful men in the city, a billionaire who could change the course of an entire company with one phone call. His mansion was like a palace, with tall white pillars, glass windows that reflected the morning sun, and gardens that stretched so far one could almost get lost in them. Yet, inside all of that wealth and power, Richard's life was missing something. He had a son, Daniel, a boy of 7 years old, full of innocence and light. But Richard's work kept him away from home most of the time. Meetings, business trips, and conferences pulled him in every direction, leaving little space for quiet family moments. In the absence of his presence, the household staff managed everything. Chefs cooked the meals, drivers brought Daniel to school, and maids kept the mansion spotless. Among them was Grace, a black maid who worked quietly in the background. She was not someone who drew attention to herself. She wore simple uniforms, kept her hair tied back neatly, and spoke only when spoken to. Most of the staff hardly noticed her beyond her duties, but Daniel did. He often found comfort in her presence. Grace had a gentle way about her, one that children sensed quickly. One chilly evening, Richard's private jet landed hours earlier than expected. A big international deal he was supposed to finalize had been postponed suddenly, freeing his schedule. It was rare for him to return home before midnight, and even rarer for him to walk into his house unannounced. As his car pulled into the long driveway, the mansion seemed quieter than usual. The front doors opened, and he stepped inside. His expensive shoes clicked against the marble floor, echoing through the wide hall. He expected to see staff moving about or hear the television in one of the living rooms, but the house was strangely calm. Only the soft humming of the heating system filled the silence. Richard walked further inside, loosening his tie. For once, he wasn't thinking about numbers or contracts. He was simply glad to be home, though he didn't admit it to himself. As he moved toward the staircase, something caught his attention, a faint sound, almost like humming, floating down from the upper floor. He stopped. It was soft, low, and filled with warmth. Curious, he climbed the stairs slowly, his polished hand gliding along the wooden railing. The sound led him toward his son's room. The door was slightly open, and a thin line of warm light spilled into the dark hallway. Richard stepped closer, his expensive watch glinting under the dim light. When he pushed the door open just a little more, the sight before him made him freeze. Grace was sitting on the edge of Daniel's bed. The boy lay against her chest, wrapped in a blanket, his face pale with fever. A damp cloth rested on the small table beside them. Grace held Daniel gently, rocking him as though he were her own child, and she hummed a soft tune, something simple and sweet. Her hand brushed his hair back tenderly, and every movement was filled with care. Richard, the man who had seen millions pass through his accounts and controlled boardrooms full of powerful executives, suddenly found himself speechless at this ordinary but extraordinary sight. His first thought was confusion. What was his maid doing here at this hour, sitting with his son so closely? But as he stood silently, his confusion turned into something else, realization. Daniel's small hand was gripping Grace's uniform as though afraid to let go. His son, who rarely spoke about emotions, had sought comfort in her arms, not in his father's. Richard felt a sharp pang in his chest. Grace had not noticed him yet. She continued to hum, dipping the cloth in a bowl of cool water and pressing it against Daniel's forehead. "You'll be all right, sweetheart," she whispered softly. "Just rest now. You're not alone." Her voice was steady, filled with compassion. Richard leaned against the doorframe, his mind racing. All these years he had provided the finest doctors, the best tutors, the most luxurious toys for his son. Yet in this simple act of care, Grace was giving something that none of his money could buy. She was giving presence, love, and comfort. For the first time in years, he felt like an outsider in his own home. Daniel stirred a little and coughed, his weak voice barely audible. "Don't go, Grace," he murmured. Her arms tightened around him, and she kissed the top of his head like a mother would. Richard swallowed hard, realizing how little he had been there for these moments. He had been too busy signing contracts while his son had been relying on someone else for the warmth he desperately needed. Finally, Grace noticed movement at the door. Her eyes widened when she saw Richard standing there. She quickly tried to adjust herself, carefully lowering Daniel back onto the bed. "I'm sorry, sir," she said nervously, her voice trembling. "He was not feeling well, and I just wanted to make sure." Richard raised his hand gently, stopping her words. His tone was not angry, but filled with a mixture of curiosity and emotion. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked quietly. Grace hesitated, glancing at Daniel, who had already closed his eyes again, his breathing slow and peaceful. "Whenever he feels sick or has nightmares," she admitted softly. "He asks for me sometimes. I didn't want to disturb you with such small things, sir. I thought it was my duty to make him feel safe." Richard felt his throat tighten. Small things. To Grace, it may have been small, but to Daniel, it was everything. And to Richard, watching from the doorway, it suddenly felt enormous. He stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to say. His pride, his wealth, his endless hours at the office, they all seemed meaningless compared to the quiet scene before him. As Grace gently tucked the blanket around Daniel and stood up, she looked down nervously, expecting a scolding. But Richard only nodded slowly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice low, almost breaking. Grace blinked in surprise. She gave a respectful bow of her head and stepped away from the bed. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He lay awake in his large room, staring at the ceiling, thinking of what he had seen. His mind kept replaying the image of Grace holding Daniel close, caring for him like a mother. It was not the first time, she had said. Which meant there had been countless nights when his son cried or felt sick, and Richard had not been there. Someone else had filled that empty space, and that someone was Grace. As dawn broke, the billionaire finally admitted something he had been avoiding for years. His wealth had given him everything except the one thing his son needed most: presence. Grace had shown him that. She had revealed a truth he had been too blind to see. The following morning felt different for Richard. He woke up in his grand bedroom, sunlight streaming through the tall curtains, but his thoughts were not on his schedule, business reports, or meetings. Instead, his mind kept returning to the image of Grace sitting at the edge of Daniel's bed, holding his son with so much care that it made Richard feel both grateful and guilty at the same time. He was a man used to control numbers, companies, negotiations. Everything in his world was precise and calculable. But what he saw last night could not be measured in profit or contracts. It was something he could not put a price tag on. Richard got dressed in silence, buttoning his crisp shirt and adjusting his tie, but there was no usual satisfaction in his morning routine. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. As he walked down the staircase, the house was slowly waking up. Staff were moving about, preparing breakfast and cleaning. From the kitchen came the smell of freshly baked bread and coffee, but Richard's steps led him toward Daniel's room again. The door was half open, and he saw Grace there once more. She was sitting by Daniel's side, helping him sip warm soup from a small cup. Daniel looked pale but slightly better. His little hands rested on the blanket, and his tired eyes lit up when he saw his father. "Daddy," he said weakly, his voice soft but happy. Richard smiled, but it was a hesitant smile, almost unsure. He walked inside slowly and placed his hand on Daniel's forehead. "How are you feeling, champ?" he asked gently. Daniel shrugged in the innocent way only children could. "Better. Grace stayed with me," he said with a small grin, looking up at her. Grace lowered her eyes, as though embarrassed by the recognition. "He had a restless night, sir," she explained softly. "The fever rose a bit, but I stayed until he settled." Richard nodded, his gaze shifting between his son and the woman who had quietly stepped into a role he himself had neglected. "And you've done this before?" "Many times," he asked carefully. Grace hesitated, unsure of whether her honesty might cost her the job. "Only when he asked for me," she replied gently. "Sometimes he has nightmares. Sometimes he feels lonely when you're away. He doesn't like to sleep alone those nights." Her words cut through Richard like a blade. He knew he had been absent, but hearing it put into such plain language was painful. Daniel's small world had been filled not with his father's presence, but with the quiet comfort of a maid who had no obligation beyond her job. Yet she had chosen to be there. Daniel suddenly tugged at Grace's sleeve. "Can you read me the story again?" he asked with childlike hope. Grace nodded with a smile and reached for the small book on the bedside table. It was an old storybook about a brave boy who rescued his village with courage and kindness. Richard stood back, watching as Grace read aloud in a calm, soothing voice. Daniel's eyes followed her every word, his smile returning with each page. For the first time, Richard realized how much his son trusted her, how deeply he depended on her presence. That trust was not built overnight. It had been growing slowly, silently, while he had been away chasing deals and signing contracts. He felt as though a mirror had been held up before him, showing him not the man the world respected, but the father his son needed and did not have. When the story ended, Daniel drifted off into a light sleep, the book resting on his chest. Grace carefully removed it and placed it on the table. She adjusted the blanket gently, making sure he was warm. When she turned, she found Richard still watching her. His eyes were filled with questions, but also something else, something softer, almost like vulnerability. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked in a quiet tone. Grace looked down, her hands clasped in front of her. "Because I thought it wasn't my place, sir. You are his father. I only wanted to help where I could. I didn't want to overstep." Richard's throat tightened. How strange, he thought, that a woman with so little by the world's standards had given his son so much more than he had. He could buy the most expensive toys, hire the finest tutors, and arrange the best doctors, but none of it mattered when Daniel simply needed someone to hold him through the night. "Grace," he said, his voice lower now, "last night I saw something I'll never forget. I saw you caring for my son as though he were your own. I I don't know how to thank you." Grace's eyes widened. She had never expected words of gratitude from the billionaire. Most of the time, he was cold, professional, and distant, treating his staff as part of the machinery that kept his life running smoothly. To hear him speak like this felt unusual, almost unbelievable. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "I only did what felt right. Children need someone to hold them when they're sick. That's all." But Richard knew it wasn't just all. It was more. It was something priceless. He looked at his son again, peaceful in sleep, his small chest rising and falling steadily. Then he turned back to Grace, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a maid, not as an employee, but as a human being who had given love without asking for anything in return. Later that morning, Richard went down to the breakfast table. Usually, Daniel would be eating quietly with the staff, but today he insisted on having Grace sit with him. "She makes me feel safe," Daniel said simply, his innocent eyes looking at his father. The words hit Richard harder than any business competitor's insult ever had. For years, he had believed his wealth was the shield and comfort for his family. But his son's comfort came from a simple act of kindness, from a woman who had nothing compared to him. He sat down, his mind heavy, but his heart stirred in ways he had not felt in years. Throughout the day, Richard found himself distracted. Meetings were scheduled, calls came in, and documents needed his signature, but he could not focus. Every time he picked up his pen, the image of Grace's gentle care returned to him. He realized he didn't even know much about her life. Who was she beyond the uniform and the quiet presence in his mansion? Why had she chosen to work in his house? In the evening, Richard decided to stay home instead of returning to his office. He spent time near Daniel, listening to his laughter as Grace told him stories and helped him with small puzzles. Watching them together, Richard felt both warmth and regret. Warmth, because his son was cared for. Regret, because he had missed so much. When Grace tucked Daniel into bed that night, Richard lingered in the hallway. He wanted to ask her more about her life, but the words didn't come easily. He was a man of business, not emotions, and yet this woman had unsettled his world with nothing but kindness. As Grace quietly closed Daniel's door, Richard finally spoke. "Grace, thank you again," he said softly, almost awkwardly. She gave a small nod, her expression respectful, and walked away to continue her duties. Richard remained standing there, staring at the closed door of his son's room. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt powerless, not because of the market, not because of rivals, but because of something far more personal. He realized his son's happiness had been protected by someone he had overlooked all along. That night, Richard stayed awake again. His mind was full of questions, doubts, and a new kind of respect he had never expected to feel. Grace had changed something inside him, and he knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Richard sat at the long dining table in the mansion, but the atmosphere was different. The usual clinking of silverware and chatter of staff was softer, almost as if everyone sensed something had shifted. Daniel was seated beside Grace, eating slowly, his cheeks still pale but with a bit more color than before. He smiled faintly as he played with his spoon, glancing up at Grace from time to time as if to make sure she wouldn't leave. Richard, sitting across from them, noticed it all. For years, he had thought of breakfast as a routine, a short moment before the day's work began. Yet now, he was seeing it through new eyes. He noticed how Daniel leaned against Grace with ease, how he laughed at her gentle jokes, how he seemed to eat better when she encouraged him. It wasn't forced, it was trust. Trust built not with money, but with patience and care. Richard tried to join in. "Daniel," he said lightly, "I heard you did some puzzles yesterday." Daniel's face brightened. "Yes, Daddy. Grace helped me. I finished the big one with the castle." His voice carried pride, and his eyes sparkled. Then he turned to Grace. "Can we do the train one today?" Grace smiled. "Of course. We'll work on it after your rest." Richard felt a strange ache in his chest. His son's joy, his comfort, his confidence all tied closely to this woman he had once thought of as just staff. He sipped his coffee slowly, pretending to read the morning paper, but his thoughts were far away. That afternoon, Richard tried to work in his home office, but the sound of Daniel's laughter drifted in from the garden. He looked out the tall window and saw Grace kneeling on the grass, helping Daniel build a small wooden track for his toy train. The boy clapped his hands as the little train rolled along, his sickness momentarily forgotten. Grace clapped too, her face glowing with genuine happiness. Richard leaned back in his chair and sighed. It had been so long since he had seen his son so joyful. Later, when Richard joined them outside, Daniel ran to him, holding the toy train in his hand. "Daddy, look. It goes all around." His excitement was infectious. Richard knelt down, smiling, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was part of his son's little world. But what surprised him even more was what happened during the week. Some of Richard's business partners visited the mansion for a private dinner. They were men and women of wealth, dressed in fine suits, speaking in sharp voices about deals and opportunities. As they gathered in the grand dining hall, Daniel came running in, holding Grace's hand. He pulled her along, asking her to sit beside him. Some of the guests exchanged puzzled looks. One whispered to another, raising an eyebrow. "Isn't that the maid?" "Yes," another replied in a hushed tone. "Strange. The boy is too attached." Richard heard them. For a man who cared deeply about appearances in business circles, their words should have embarrassed him. But instead, he felt an unexpected protectiveness rise within him. When Daniel insisted that Grace sit next to him at the long table, Richard nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Grace looked nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she sat down. She wasn't used to being at the table with such powerful people, but Daniel's small smile gave her courage. The dinner began, but the murmurs among the guests continued. One of them, a man known for his arrogance, leaned toward Richard with a mocking smile. "Richard, it seems your son prefers the company of the help. That is unusual." His tone carried a hint of insult. Richard put down his fork slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto the man. For a moment, the room went silent, everyone waiting for his reaction. In the past, Richard might have laughed it off or brushed it aside, but now, he felt differently. He spoke with a steady, commanding voice. "My son prefers the company of someone who gives him what none of you could buy with all your wealth: comfort, love, and loyalty. And for that, I respect her more than I respect many who sit at this table." The entire room went quiet. The arrogant man's smile faded, replaced with shock. Grace lowered her gaze, her face flushed, not from shame but from disbelief. No one had ever defended her in such a public way, let alone someone like Richard. Daniel, innocent to the tension in the room, simply hugged Grace's arm and said, "See, Daddy knows too." His words melted the silence, and a few guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. After the dinner, when the guests left, Richard walked into the garden to clear his mind. The night air was cool, and the stars stretched across the sky like scattered diamonds. He thought about what he had said. The words had come from somewhere deep inside him, surprising even himself. But they were true. Grace had done more for Daniel than any relative, any teacher, any nanny he had hired before. When Grace came outside to check on him, she looked unsure. "Sir, I hope I didn't cause any trouble tonight," she said softly. Richard turned to her, his face serious but kind. "Grace, you caused no trouble. You reminded me of what matters. For too long, I've measured everything by success and money. But what I saw tonight, what I've seen these past days, has shown me I was wrong." Grace blinked, touched but overwhelmed. "I only did what anyone with a heart would do," she replied. Richard shook his head. "No. Not everyone would. You've given my son something even I couldn't give him. And that makes you extraordinary." That night, Richard sat by Daniel's bedside for the first time in years. Grace had already tucked him in, but Daniel reached out, holding his father's hand. "Daddy, can you stay until I sleep?" Richard's heart ached. He nodded, pulling the chair closer. As he sat there, Daniel's breathing slowed, and soon he was asleep. Richard looked at his son's peaceful face and then at Grace, who quietly left the room to give them space. When he finally walked back to his own room, Richard realized something important. Grace had not only changed his son's life, but she had begun to change his own. She had shown him a truth he had ignored, that the greatest wealth a man could have was not in his bank account, but in the love and trust of his family. For the first time in years, Richard slept with a quiet heart. The days that followed brought quiet changes to the mansion. Richard was no longer the same distant figure who only appeared briefly in the mornings before disappearing into a world of boardrooms and luxury cars. He began to linger more often, sitting with Daniel during meals, listening to his stories, and even laughing at his silly jokes. Grace noticed the change but tried to keep her distance, believing her role was still only that of a maid. Yet, in the silence of the mansion's wide halls, she sensed that something was shifting inside the billionaire. One evening, Richard prepared to host another dinner, this time with some of the most powerful business leaders in the city. The mansion glowed with light, chandeliers sparkling, tables set with silver and crystal. The staff moved briskly, ensuring everything was perfect. Grace worked quietly, as usual, making sure Daniel had eaten before the event began. She had no intention of being anywhere near the dining hall. But Daniel, clinging to her hand, insisted, "Stay with me. Please. I don't like it when you leave." Grace smiled gently. "I'll be nearby, sweetheart. You'll be fine." But Daniel pouted, his grip firm. He had grown too used to her presence, and his little heart refused to let go. When the guests arrived, tall men in tailored suits and women in glittering dresses, they filled the hall with the sound of wealth and pride. The air buzzed with conversation about stocks, mergers, and international deals. To them, the mansion was just another palace of power. Yet, amid the clinking of glasses, Daniel entered, holding Grace's hand. He pulled her toward the table without hesitation. Several guests exchanged looks, their raised eyebrows sharp enough to cut glass. One whispered behind a napkin, "Isn't that the maid again?" Another chuckled under his breath. Soon, the murmurs spread like wildfire across the long table. Richard noticed. He had been talking about a new investment project, but his attention shifted instantly. His son had chosen Grace once more, showing in front of the most powerful men and women that she was the one he trusted above all others. The guests' whispers grew louder, some mocking, some questioning, until finally one bold guest spoke openly. "Richard," the man said with a smirk, his voice loud enough for all to hear, "your boy seems to think very highly of the staff. It is unusual, don't you think? For a child to hold a maid's hand at the table when he has so much family and wealth around him." Laughter rippled quietly across the table. Grace froze in her seat, her face heating with embarrassment. She tried to pull her hand away from Daniel's, but the boy clung tighter. Daniel frowned at the laughter, not understanding why the grown ups were being unkind. The room waited for Richard's response. All eyes turned to him, expecting the usual cold, polished businessman who would dismiss the matter quickly and return to speaking of profits. But this time, something different happened. Richard slowly rose from his chair, his tall figure commanding silence. His gaze swept across the table, sharp and steady. "My son does think highly of her," he said firmly. His voice carried no hesitation, only truth. "And I do too." The laughter died instantly. The smirk on the bold guest's face vanished. The room became so quiet that the sound of Daniel tapping his fork on the table could be heard. Richard continued, his tone stronger now. "Grace has done more for my son than many of you could ever understand. She has given him comfort when he was sick, held him when he was lonely, and cared for him when I was too blind to see what he needed. She has been more family to him than anyone at this table. And if you think that is something to mock, then perhaps you should look at your own homes first." Gasps escaped from a few guests. Grace's hands trembled in her lap. No one had ever spoken of her like that. No one had ever defended her, let alone a man like Richard, in front of such powerful people. Daniel's face lit up. He looked at his father with pride and whispered, "See, I told you she's the best." Richard gave a small smile to his son before turning back to the table. "From today," he announced clearly, "Grace is no longer just a maid in this house. She is Daniel's official caretaker. She will have a salary, benefits, and respect equal to her role in my son's life. And I expect every person under this roof to treat her as such." The declaration landed like thunder. Some guests were speechless, their forks frozen mid-air. Others exchanged shocked glances, unable to believe that the cold billionaire had spoken so warmly about someone society considered beneath him. A few even coughed uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Grace's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. She had never asked for recognition. All she wanted was to do her work and bring comfort where she could. Yet now, here she was, elevated in a way she never thought possible. She bowed her head slightly, whispering, "Thank you, sir," her voice barely audible. The dinner continued, but the energy in the room was different. No one dared make another mocking remark. Richard spoke confidently about business, but his earlier words lingered in every corner of the hall. For the first time, Grace felt not invisible but seen, truly seen. Later that night, when the guests had left and the mansion grew quiet again, Grace stood in the kitchen, still trying to process what had happened. She looked down at her worn uniform, her tired hands, and wondered if she had imagined it all. But then Richard entered, his footsteps soft. "You didn't cause trouble tonight," he said, reading the doubt in her eyes. "You gave my son happiness. That is more valuable than any deal I could ever close." Grace swallowed hard, emotion tightening her chest. "I never wanted attention, sir. I only wanted him to feel safe." "And he does," Richard replied gently. "Because of you." For the first time, the walls between employer and maid seemed to crack. Richard wasn't speaking as a billionaire, but as a father. And Grace wasn't hearing him as an employee, but as someone whose kindness had finally been recognized. That night, Daniel slept soundly, his fever gone, his dreams peaceful. Grace checked on him one last time before leaving, but when she turned, she found Richard standing at the door. He gave her a nod of respect, something far greater than any order or command. In the silence of that moment, Grace realized that everything had changed not just for her, but for the boy she had cared for and the father who was slowly learning what truly mattered. The weeks after that unforgettable dinner were unlike anything the mansion had ever known. The air inside the great house felt lighter, warmer, almost as if the walls themselves had begun to breathe differently. For the first time in many years, the rooms echoed not only with footsteps of staff or the clinking of dishes but also with laughter, conversation, and the simple sounds of family life. Richard had changed. Grace had changed. Most importantly, little Daniel had changed. Richard's business life had always been demanding. He was known in the city as a man who never rested, never slowed down, always chasing the next big deal. But after the evening he publicly defended Grace, something inside him shifted. He began to reschedule meetings. He cancelled late-night dinners that had nothing to do with his heart and everything to do with money. Instead, he spent his evenings at home, sitting with his son, watching him grow, and learning to listen. Grace, too, noticed the transformation. At first, she was unsure. She thought maybe the change would not last, that Richard's old habits would soon return and the mansion would once again feel cold and empty. But day after day, she saw him showing up reading Daniel's schoolwork, clapping as the boy completed his puzzles, laughing softly at the little jokes only a child could make. Grace realized this was no small change. It was real. One morning, Daniel woke up full of energy, his fever completely gone. He ran through the mansion halls, laughing, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. Grace followed with a smile, carrying his jacket for when he would tire himself out. Richard, watching from the stairwell, felt a deep relief. For the first time in months, his son looked strong, not only in body but in spirit. At breakfast, Daniel proudly showed his father a drawing he had made. It was simple, a stick figure family holding hands. On one side stood Richard, tall and smiling. On the other side stood Daniel, small and cheerful. And in the middle, holding both their hands, was Grace. The drawing was shaky, the lines uneven, but the message was clear. Richard looked at it for a long time, his throat tight. He glanced at Grace, who blushed and looked down, embarrassed but touched. Daniel grinned and said, "It's us." My family. Those words stayed with Richard all day. He carried the drawing to his office, setting it on his desk beside his expensive pens and files. Each time he glanced at it, he was reminded of what mattered more than all the contracts in the world. News of what had happened at the dinner spread quickly among the social circles of the wealthy. People whispered about how the cold billionaire had defended his maid in front of everyone. Some mocked him, calling it weakness. Others admired him quietly, realizing it took strength to go against pride and tradition. But Richard didn't care what anyone said. For once, the opinions of the world did not matter. His focus was on Daniel, and on making up for the time he had lost. One weekend, Richard surprised both Grace and Daniel. Instead of spending Saturday in his office, he suggested they go to the park together. Daniel's face lit up with joy. Grace was hesitant, unsure if she should join, but Daniel insisted, holding her hand and dragging her along. In the park, they walked under the tall trees, watched children fly kites, and sat on the benches while Daniel played. Richard sat beside Grace, the two of them quietly watching the boy. "Thank you," Richard said suddenly, breaking the silence. Grace looked at him, puzzled. "For what, sir?" "For giving me back my son," he replied simply. "For reminding me what love looks like." His eyes were sincere, his voice heavy with unspoken emotion. Grace lowered her gaze, her heart full, unsure how to respond. Daniel ran back to them, holding two flowers he had picked from the grass. He handed one to Grace and one to his father. "For you both," he said proudly. They both smiled, and in that simple act, the bond between the three of them grew even stronger. As weeks turned into months, Richard's life looked completely different. He was still a billionaire, still respected in the business world, but people began to notice he no longer carried the same cold aura. At board meetings, he was calmer, more patient. At home, he was softer, more human. The staff whispered about how much he had changed, and they all knew the reason: Grace's quiet influence and Daniel's innocent love. Grace's own life changed as well. With her new position as Daniel's caretaker, she was able to support her younger siblings better. She no longer had to work two jobs, running from one employer to another. For the first time, she could breathe, rest, and focus not only on her work but also on her own dreams. Yet she never let the new title change her heart. She remained humble, kind, and devoted. One evening, Richard sat with Daniel in the study, helping him with homework. Daniel, frustrated with a math problem, sighed loudly. "I can't do it, Daddy." Richard smiled and patted his shoulder. "Yes, you can. Try again." But when Daniel still looked stuck, Grace gently stepped in, kneeling beside him. With patience and a warm smile, she explained the problem in simple words until Daniel's eyes lit up with understanding. He scribbled the answer proudly, then hugged her. Richard watched silently, realizing again that Grace had a gift he did not possess: patience born of love. Later, when Daniel had gone to bed, Richard lingered in the hallway. He saw Grace adjusting the blankets around the boy, brushing his hair back, and whispering a quiet prayer. It moved him deeply. After she left the room, he stopped her in the hall. "You've given him more than I ever could on my own," he admitted softly. "I don't know how to repay you." Grace shook her head. "You don't need to repay me, sir. Children need love. That is enough." But Richard thought differently. He knew he could never put a price on what she had given, but he also knew he could never again treat her as someone ordinary. She was extraordinary. In the months that followed, the mansion became a home, not just a house. Richard and Daniel grew closer than ever. They played games in the garden, read books together, and even cooked once with Grace guiding them. The staff often smiled quietly, saying they had never seen such warmth within those grand walls. Word spread outside too. Stories of the billionaire who valued kindness above pride began circulating. Some called it shocking. Some called it inspiring. But for Richard, it was simply the truth. He had finally understood what mattered most. One evening, as they all sat in the living room, Daniel curled up between his father and Grace, Richard looked at them both and realized something life-changing. Money could buy him the biggest mansion, the fastest cars, the rarest art, but it could never buy what he had right here: love, trust, and the simple joy of belonging. That night, as the boy drifted to sleep in their presence, Richard felt peace in his heart. For the first time in years, the billionaire did not think about numbers, deals, or contracts. He thought about family. He thought about the woman who had nursed his son when no one else had, and about the little boy who had reminded him of what truly mattered. And in that quiet moment, he knew his life had been forever changed.